If I ever end up like that, shoot me. Those words came from Johnny Carson himself, about a guest the entire country adored.
What are you gonna do? Okay. I got all kinds of problems, Johnny. My daughter got pregnant.
These are the 10 guests who pushed Johnny Carson past his breaking point during 30 years behind the Tonight Show desk, the men and women who left America's most controlled, most rehearsed host scrambling, speechless, or simply standing in someone else's spotlight.
And I said, I didn't know whether you were putting me on. Then I thought of this horrible...
Most people remember Johnny Carson as the smoothest interviewer television ever produced, a host who never broke composure no matter who sat across from him. What almost nobody remembers is how often that composure was an act, how many nights he was privately furious, quietly humiliated, or fighting just to keep his own show from spinning out of his hands. Tonight we're going through exactly who did that to him, what happened when they did it, and why one of these guests hurt him so badly that Johnny Carson refused to speak to her again for the rest of his life. This isn't a list of guests who simply told a bad joke or ran long on time. Every single name coming up tonight either embarrassed him on camera, outperformed him in front of his own audience, frustrated him behind the scenes for years, or broke a trust he never offered easily in the first place. Some of these stories end in laughter. At least one of them never really ends at all. Let's start at the edges of the list, with the names casual fans rarely connect to any trouble at all, because by the time we reach the top, you'll understand exactly why Johnny Carson kept a list of people who were never invited back. Number 10 might not jump out at you right away. But stick with this one, because it sets the tone for everything that's coming. By the time Peter O'Toole's name comes up among longtime Tonight Show viewers, it isn't tied to one single broadcast. It's tied to a pattern, one that repeated itself across his run of guest appearances throughout the 1970s and into the 80s. O'Toole arrived at that desk as one of the most respected actors alive, the man who had played Lawrence of Arabia, a voice that commanded a room before he said a word. Carson, like any host, expected the kind of interview where the guest carries half the conversation. With O'Toole, that wasn't always the deal he got. According to longtime fans who tuned in during those visits, the actor would drift. A question about a film would turn into a story about something else entirely, or trail off mid-sentence, or arrive somewhere far from where it started. The studio audience would shift in their seats. The cameras stayed locked on Carson's face, waiting to see how he would handle it. And handle it he did. He leaned into the dead air with a joke of his own, redirected the conversation, occasionally answered his own question just to keep the segment moving forward. More than once, Johnny Carson became the funniest person in an interview that was supposed to belong entirely to his guest. It's one of the more quietly remembered patterns of the Carson era. Not a scandal, not a feud, just a curious reversal of roles that longtime fans still bring up when they talk about the nights Johnny had to work twice as hard for half the credit. It's a small reminder that even the most legendary guests didn't always show up ready to perform, and that sometimes the real skill on that stage belonged entirely to the man behind the desk. What makes the O'Toole appearances worth remembering isn't a single explosive moment, the way some entries further down this list will be. It's the quiet, repeated proof that Carson's real talent wasn't just asking good questions, it was rescuing bad answers in real time, night after night, without the audience at home ever realizing how much work was happening behind that easy, practiced smile. Charles Nelson Riley didn't need a special occasion to cause trouble. He just needed a microphone. Across his many appearances on The Tonight Show, Riley built a reputation as a guest who arrived fast-talking and left the format in pieces. He was a familiar face to American audiences through game shows and Broadway, known for being quick, theatrical, and almost impossible to predict. Everything would look like a normal interview segment at first. Carson would ask a simple question. And that's when Riley would take it somewhere nobody in the control room had planned for, a tangent, a bit, a sudden change of subject that pulled the entire studio along with him. What happened next became one of the most familiar rhythms of any Riley appearance. The host who controlled every other guest on the couch would find himself reacting instead of directing, laughing instead of leading, trying to find the on-ramp back to the actual topic. Audiences loved it precisely because it was unscripted. Riley hijacking a segment became, over the years, one of the more dependable forms of chaos the show could offer, the kind viewers tuned in hoping to catch. That is precisely why his appearances are still remembered as some of the most purely entertaining chaos Carson ever invited onto his own stage. Where other difficult guests created tension, Riley created delight, and the difference between the two is exactly why Carson, despite never quite being able to predict him, kept inviting him back year after year. Bette Davis did not come to The Tonight Show to be charming. She came to say exactly what she thought, and Johnny Carson, more than once, had to keep up. By the time Davis sat across from Carson, she had already spent decades building a reputation in Hollywood for speaking her mind regardless of who was listening. She had survived feuds with studio executives, public disagreements with fellow actors, and a career built on refusing to soften herself for anyone's comfort. That reputation followed her onto the couch. She dominated her interviews from the opening question, steering the conversation wherever she wanted it to go. Where most guests softened their opinions for a late-night audience, Davis never did. Where most guests treated Carson's desk as his territory, Davis treated it as a stage she happened to be sharing. The contrast was obvious to anyone watching: Carson, polished and controlled, against a guest who answered every question on her own terms and never once seemed intimidated by the man asking them. There was no blow-up, no scandal, no walkout. The tension was quieter than that, and somehow more uncomfortable, the sense that the most powerful man in late-night television was, for a few minutes, not the one steering the ship. She wasn't there to entertain Johnny. Johnny had to keep up with her, and that alone made her one of the most quietly formidable guests to ever sit on that couch. It's worth remembering that this was, in its own way, rarer than any blow-up. Carson had built his entire career on being the most comfortable person in any room he occupied. Davis simply never let him have that comfort, and she never raised her voice to take it away from him. Before Rodney Dangerfield became one of the most recognizable comedians in America, he was just another stand-up trying to land a few minutes on The Tonight Show stage. Nobody in the building expected what was about to happen. Dangerfield walked out, ran through his rapid-fire routine of self-deprecating one-liners, and the audience response was immediate. Carson, who held enormous power over who got invited to sit on the couch after their set, made the call that changed Dangerfield's career forever. That single invitation mattered more than almost anything else that happened on the show that night. For a stand-up comedian in that era, getting waved over to sit beside Johnny Carson after a set was the most valuable currency in show business, a public endorsement broadcast into millions of homes. What happened next became one of the defining success stories of the Carson era. Dangerfield's career accelerated almost overnight. He became a fixture of American comedy, a household name built in large part on the strength of that one Tonight Show appearance and the attention that followed it. It is one of the rare entries on this list where Carson didn't lose control of a moment so much as set one in motion that grew far bigger than the show itself. A single gesture from behind the desk changed a comedian's life forever, and it's a reminder that the same power Carson used to end careers, he also used, just as often, to build them. In a list built almost entirely around tension, friction, and things spiraling out of Carson's grip, Dangerfield's story stands apart as proof of just how much power that desk actually carried, and how differently things could go when Carson chose to use it generously. Where most comedians wanted the audience laughing, Andy Kaufman wanted them confused, and more often than not, he got exactly what he wanted. Across his appearances on The Tonight Show through the 1970s, Kaufman built an entire career out of blurring the line between performance and reality. He would arrive in character, commit completely, and refuse to give anyone, including Carson, any clear signal about where the act ended and the real Andy Kaufman began. This wasn't an accident or a quirk of nerves. It was, by every account, deliberate. Kaufman had built his entire approach to comedy around discomfort, around audiences who couldn't decide whether what they were watching was genius, an elaborate joke, or something closer to a man genuinely losing his grip on a bit that had gone too far. Carson's desk had hosted thousands of performers who wanted to be liked. Kaufman, more often than not, didn't seem to care whether anyone liked him at all. Carson's greatest skill, the thing that made him the most trusted host in television, was his ability to read a room and control it. With Kaufman, that skill simply didn't apply. There was no follow-up question that worked, because there was no way to know what Kaufman would do with it. Strange characters. Intentional awkwardness. Anti-comedy routines that left the studio audience uncertain whether to laugh, applaud, or sit in stunned silence. What happened next, almost every time, was the same kind of confusion rippling outward from the stage into the studio and eventually into the homes watching at night. Nobody was entirely sure what they had just seen, and that uncertainty became the entire point. Johnny's greatest skill was controlling the room. Kaufman made that impossible, and decades later, people still debate what was real and what wasn't in those appearances, which is exactly the kind of legacy Andy Kaufman would have wanted. Other guests on this list challenged Carson with insults, with chaos, with raw talent he couldn't match in the moment. Kaufman challenged him with something harder to fight back against entirely: uncertainty. You can recover from a joke that lands wrong. It's much harder to recover when you genuinely don't know whether the joke was a joke at all. Bob Hope was one of the most beloved entertainers in American history, and according to people who worked closely with Johnny Carson, he may have also been one of Carson's least favorite guests to interview. Hope had been a star since long before Carson ever took over The Tonight Show desk, a fixture of American comedy who built his name through radio, film, USO tours, and an endless string of network specials. By the time he sat across from Carson on a regular basis, Hope had little reason to change a formula that had worked for him for decades, and that consistency, the very thing audiences loved about him, became the exact thing that made him difficult to interview. Hope appeared on The Tonight Show more times than almost any other star of his era, a reliable, bankable guest who could fill an episode without much effort. But reliability came with a cost. Hope relied heavily on prepared material. He rarely improvised. Several of his appearances, by the accounts of people close to the show, leaned more toward promoting his latest special than engaging in any real conversation with his host. Where Carson thrived on spontaneity, the unplanned moment, the joke that came from nowhere, Hope brought structure and rehearsal. The two approaches to comedy sat uneasily next to each other on camera, and several Carson associates later admitted that Johnny grew visibly frustrated whenever Hope's name showed up on the night's guest list. The breaking point, according to one account, came after a particularly flat appearance. Carson allegedly turned to his staff afterward and joked, "If I ever end up like that, shoot me," the very line that opened tonight's video. America loved Bob Hope. Few people knew that the host welcoming him onto the stage night after night may have privately dreaded every single one of those conversations, a reminder that the warmest handshake on television didn't always mean the warmest feelings behind it. It's a strange kind of entry for this list, because nothing about it ever played out in public. There was no walkout, no confrontation, no headline the next morning. Just a private frustration that built quietly across years of appearances, the kind of tension that never makes it into the highlight reel but shapes a working relationship all the same. Not every difficult guest got a second chance. Some of them got none at all. Throughout his 3 decades behind the Tonight Show desk, Carson reportedly kept what amounted to an informal blacklist, a quiet, unofficial list of guests who would simply never be invited back. The reasons varied. Poor performances that dragged a broadcast down. Mistreatment of the crew working behind the cameras. Personal conflicts that never got resolved. Violations of the show's unwritten rules about what guests could and couldn't do once the cameras were rolling. Names connected to this list over the years, according to various accounts from people close to the production, reportedly included Jay Leno, who was said to have faced a temporary ban early in his career before going on to inherit the very chair Carson once sat in. William Shatner. Jerry Lewis. Steve Allen. Ellen DeGeneres. Some bans were temporary disputes that eventually faded. Others, by most accounts, were permanent. What made this side of Carson so striking was the contrast with the warmth audiences saw every night on screen. Where the on-camera Johnny Carson was endlessly generous with his guests, the off-camera Johnny Carson could apparently be unforgiving, precise, and entirely final once someone crossed a line he considered serious enough. Sources close to the show describe a man who could be extremely loyal to the people he trusted, but once that trust broke, the door simply closed, and it rarely opened again. It's the side of Carson the cameras never showed, and it's exactly why this entry sits this high on tonight's list. Think about that for a second. A man whose entire on-screen persona was built on warmth and approachability was, behind the scenes, capable of cutting people out permanently, without a public statement, without an explanation, without ever giving the band guest a reason. That's not the Johnny Carson most people grew up watching, and it's exactly why this part of his legacy stayed hidden for so long. By 1991, Johnny Carson had spent nearly 3 decades mastering the art of controlling a Tonight Show interview. Then Robin Williams and Jonathan Winters sat down together, and for one unforgettable night, that mastery didn't matter at all. The pairing alone was loaded. Williams had built much of his own comic identity on the kind of rapid-fire, free associating improvisation that Winters had pioneered decades earlier, and putting both men on the same couch at the same time was less an interview than lighting a fuse. Carson, an experienced host who had handled thousands of guests by that point, still walked into the segment with a plan for how the conversation would go. That plan lasted only a few minutes. Williams and Winters fed off each other immediately, bouncing from voice to voice, character to character, building on each other's bits faster than any host could realistically interject. The studio audience, sensing something rare unfolding in real time, exploded with laughter that kept building instead of settling down. What happened next became one of the most replayed exchanges in the show's entire history. Carson, normally the one steering every conversation toward its next beat, found himself simply reacting, laughing, occasionally trying and failing to get a word in before the next wave of improvisation rolled over him. For one night, Johnny wasn't the funniest man on that stage, and the remarkable thing is how visibly he seemed to enjoy losing that title. It remains one of the most cited examples of The Tonight Show at its rawest and most alive, proof that even the most rehearsed format in television could still be hijacked by pure, unscripted talent. Clips from that appearance still circulate decades later, passed around as a kind of masterclass in improvisation, two comedians at the absolute height of their craft, feeding off each other so quickly that trying to transcribe it afterward never quite captures what it felt like to watch live. It's the kind of segment that reminds you why people still talk about The Tonight Show as something closer to a live wire than a polished broadcast. Don Rickles built an entire career on a simple premise: nobody was safe from his insults, and that included Johnny Carson himself. Across his many Tonight Show appearances, Rickles established himself as one of the only guests willing to turn his act directly on his host, mocking Carson's wardrobe, his desk, his mannerisms, anything within reach, without a hint of the deference most guests showed. Carson, to his credit, usually let it happen and laughed along, aware that Rickles' insults were the entire point of inviting him on. The most famous collision between the two men didn't even happen on Carson's own broadcast. While guest host Bob Newhart was running the show one night, Rickles wandered onto the set, picked up Carson's cigarette box sitting on the desk, and broke it, an accident, but a costly one given how personally Carson treated his own desk and its contents. And that's when things escalated in exactly the way Rickles seemed to be hoping for. Carson found out, and rather than letting it go, he marched directly onto the set of Rickles' own sitcom, pretending to be furious, demanding an explanation in front of the cameras for what had happened to his property. The confrontation that followed became one of the funniest, most quoted exchanges in Tonight Show history, two men who clearly respected each other locked in a mock feud that delighted everyone watching. Rickles remains remembered as one of the only people alive who could make Johnny Carson look, even briefly, completely helpless, and that clip is still circulated today as one of the era's most beloved unscripted bits. What separates Rickles from almost everyone else on this list is that Carson never seemed to resent it. The other entries tonight involve frustration, confusion, or heartbreak. With Rickles, it was something closer to genuine affection disguised as outrage, a friendship so secure that neither man ever worried it could be damaged by a broken cigarette box or a staged tantrum on a sitcom set. For years, there was no guest closer to Johnny Carson than Joan Rivers. He discovered her talent early, in 1965, and from there personally mentored her rise through the industry, giving her stage time, advice, and the kind of public endorsement that could make or break a young comedian's career in that era. Rivers became something rare on The Tonight Show, not just a frequent guest, but the show's permanent guest host, the person Carson trusted to sit in his chair when he wasn't there himself. To an outsider, the relationship looked almost like family, a mentor and his protege, built over more than 20 years of loyalty on both sides. Everything looked secure right up until 1986. Rivers had been offered her own competing late-night program on the newly forming Fox network, a serious opportunity, the kind any comedian in her position would have to consider. And that's when she made the decision that changed everything. She accepted the offer without personally telling Carson first. What happened next became one of the most devastating personal ruptures in television history. Carson found out, and rather than confronting her, he simply stopped speaking to her, permanently. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers launched that same year, but the friendship that had defined more than 2 decades of her career did not survive the announcement. Carson never spoke to her again for the rest of his life. Rivers herself later called it one of the greatest heartbreaks she ever experienced, a wound that never fully closed even decades later. The woman Johnny Carson had personally built up, trusted with his own chair, and treated like family became the one guest he never, under any circumstance, forgave. No script, no rehearsal, and no amount of polish could manufacture a betrayal like that one. It happened because two people who had built something real together watched it collapse over a single decision, and neither of them ever got the chance to repair it. Of every name on tonight's list, Rivers is the only one whose story doesn't end in laughter, replayed clips, or a fond piece of television trivia. It ends in silence, the specific kind of silence that only exists between two people who once meant everything to each other. That's why, of every guest who ever sat across from Johnny Carson, she remains the one he simply could not handle losing. Over 30 years and roughly 4,000 episodes, Johnny Carson interviewed thousands upon thousands of guests, and only a small handful of them ever genuinely took control of the show out of his hands. And that's exactly what makes these 10 so unforgettable, not because Johnny Carson was weak in front of any of them, but because for a few unscripted minutes at a time, the most polished host in television history became just as human, just as caught off guard, as the audience watching him at home. Some of these guests made him laugh until he couldn't speak. Some of them made him furious enough to ban them for good. One of them broke his heart so completely that he carried the silence between them all the way to the end of his life. And through all of it, Carson kept doing the one thing that made him legendary in the first place. He stayed at that desk, night after night, and let whoever sat across from him decide how the conversation would actually go. No teleprompter, no rehearsal, and no 30 years of polish could have prepared Johnny Carson for the nights these guests walked onto his stage, because the very thing that made The Tonight Show legendary was the one thing nobody, not even Johnny, could ever fully control: the unpredictable people sitting across from that desk.